I'm with Rick Wienecke today. Rick's in Arad, Israel, just southwest, I guess it is, of the Dead Sea, and where he has his gallery, the Fountain of Tears. Many of you have met Rick before or are familiar with him. And I wanted Rick to begin to share his story, parts of his story, of his interaction with God, because we're in a time when it becomes very important for all of us to step into a whole new dimension of our connection with Him, so that we are confident that when we engage with the Lord, interact with Him, that we can converse with Him. Because listening to the Lord and responding to Him and Him responding to us is really at the heart of the covenant that He made with us. And so Rick has had a number of experiences, and his whole experience really with the Lord is very different from many people, from mine. But it's one that helps us to see how God brings us into this interaction even for us now. So Rick, I'm glad you're here. We're going to record several segments, so this theme will develop. But Rick, why don't you share with people for just a moment, just a little bit of the background of what brought you from Canada, where you grew up and where you lived as a young adult, to Israel.
Okay. The whole aspect of, say, the period of time before going to Israel was what I would have considered being a normal Canadian youth. It was during the end of the 60s, beginning of 70s, it was all drugs, sex, and rock and roll. That was the primary focus of life, for sure. Until it brought me to a place that I knew one thing really clearly, was that if something didn't change, I was either going to be dead or I was going to be in prison, for sure.
So your background wasn't a religious one?
No. Well, see, there was attempts by my mother primarily to bring us maybe into a sense of like a Presbyterian background.
Okay.
But I realized early as a child, sitting in a church service, having a really difficult time not to misbehave and stuff, but you began to realize that the adults were just as bored as you were.
Right.
During the, and they could hardly wait. When the guy ended with the amen deal, and it was like, and that was it, everybody charged out to the donut shop and got a coffee and seemed relieved. So as far as religion and everything else, it didn't interest me. I didn't see it as a reality. But the one thing I always had felt like was that there must be a creator out there.
Okay.
You could never, Canada, for one thing, for me, always reflected consistently every fall. You would see a palette of colors within the changing of the leaves. And it was even being so self-absorbed in myself and all the stuff that I was doing, I couldn't argue that somebody had to create this. It wasn't a result of an explosion. But in all of this, there was a sense of searching. I was searching for something because I was desperate, and I knew that, again, the whole sense of death or jail was like real evident to me. Ended up reading a book called Exodus by Leon Uris, and all of a sudden I get introduced to.
Now that's not a religious book. That's not a religious book.
No, not the book of Exodus.
Right.
It was like a novel, historical novel, but it introduced me to Israel as a nation, the Jewish people struggling after the time of the Holocaust. I didn't know what the Holocaust was. I didn't know what a Jew was. If anybody would have asked me at the time about the Middle East, I would have described it as, it's like a totally crazy place that every 2 weeks it's a bunch of Arabs doing war, and who cares? If it doesn't affect my Friday night, Saturday night, which was my primary self-worship time, it was like, well, it's not important. But all of a sudden, within reading these points of history, something started to happen to me on the inside. And at that point, I didn't know I had an inside. Everything, I lived outside all the time, but all of a sudden, in a sense, I could feel something being touched inside of me that I didn't even know was there. And it fascinated me and it scared me all at the same time. And I kept on thinking, is this God? Is this, what is this? What is God exactly? Is that like an energy or is it a personality? What's the deal? But it all got interwoven in the historical beginnings of Israel as a nation in 1948 with the backdrop of the Holocaust. Until finally I came to a point I thought, I can't read any more books. I have to go and see this place.
Yeah.
So at that point, 77, then beginning of 77, I fly to Israel. But in my mind, I'm going to a place that I'm looking for God. And I think he's got something to do with these guys in this country, because how in the world could they have survived the Holocaust, and only 3 years after that, be declaring themselves as a nation against every odd possible? And so it fascinated me. And so in the, making the steps to go to Israel, I was introduced to the possibility of working on a kibbutz, and that I could learn Hebrew because I was intending on being on the kibbutz for 6 months. And I had in my mind I'd be in Israel for 6 months, and then I would backpack through Europe for 6 months, take a year. But the primary focus was to see this place, and I'm looking for God. And I never said it out loud to anybody because most people in my family thought I was pretty whacked anyway at that. I'd done a lot of stupid stuff. But the idea of trying to explain to people in my family that I'm going to Israel, if I'd have said to them, I'm looking for God, and I think he has something to do with the Jews, they would have wrapped me in cellophane and put me in an institution for sure. And I knew that. So I just decided I wasn't going to tell anybody until a few days before getting on the plane. So if they wanted to get mad, they only had 2 days to get mad about it because I was leaving. But the kibbutz, going to the kibbutz for me was almost like, I look at it now, prophetic hindsight is much easier. And you look back and you see the hand of the Lord on so many points that you're trying to make a decision. And then all of a sudden, you're given the opportunity after you've come into relationship with him that you look back and he asks you to remember these moments that circumstantially he is speaking to you. There's a lot of, I always look at it and I think to myself, Jesus's modus operandi for his entire life was, I do what I see my Father doing. I speak what I hear my Father speaking. That was it. That was this whole mode of living. And I always look at circumstances, especially strange ones that would happen. I would look at that, and if I couldn't explain it, or it was something really weird outside of the natural, a bunch of circumstances, I would always feel like, Lord, are you trying to say something here? And I would have to stop my life, take a look at the circumstance, because I'm thinking, the Father's doing something here. He's trying to get my attention. Because I think that's his biggest problem with us in communication. Right. We are always the problem, not him. He wants to communicate to us. He wants relationship. He wants to be able to speak to our hearts. He wants us to be able to understand what he's saying to us. But we're the ADD personalities. We're the ones that are too busy, or we've constricted them to a certain framework, a certain religious framework. And so he can't possibly step out of that, or we get freaked out. But it's like, there were so many circumstances that happened to me when I started to come to the kibbutz. And this was before I had fully given myself to the Lord. I gave myself to a relationship with Jesus at the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem a number of months after getting there. And I started to meet believers in the land. There were very few believers in the land in those days. But a couple guys that I had met, some Jewish believers, and they would always talk about hearing from God. And it's like, and then they would tell these incredible stories. I love these stories. And it's like, during this whole period of time on the kibbutz, I'm meeting all kinds of different people, but there were people there learning Hebrew in a special program on the kibbutz that they had said it was okay for me to be in. It was primarily Jewish youth thinking about doing immigration to Israel. And so they would take a period of time learning Hebrew. But there were also non-Jews, like Gentiles, say, that they would allow in. So it was me, they allowed it 10%. It was me and a Japanese guy. We were the token Gentiles thrown into the group. But alongside the people learning Hebrew, there were also volunteers on the kibbutz, people that, they travel all over the world.
Right.
I met this German girl in the group of the volunteers that were on the kibbutz. We started to get to know each other, and I was like brand new believer in Jesus at this point. And so I was, introducing her in a sense to some of the believers that I had met in the land. And then she decided to give her life to the Lord. And so both of us are like brand new believers. And it's like, so we're experiencing, because there isn't a framework of church services, say, that you could go to, or any kind of service.
Yeah.
It was points of relationship that if we went to visit friends who were a family, say, up in Nazareth, and you'd go visit them and you'd spend the weekend, all you did was talk about Jesus from the time you were there to the time you went back to the kibbutz. But it was all a reality of relationship of what the Lord had been doing that day or 2 days ago. And we would share then our experiences in following him. It was fantastic. It was great. And so the relationship between me and between her began to develop. And so it was getting
Hold on, Rick. Hold on just a moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the relationship was with Jesus first, then meeting this German girl, and then meeting a few other believers within the land. But both of us are hearing a reality of hearing from the Lord on almost like as a part of your life. And then it became then testimonies or stories that you would swap with other believers, which was great. But it was a real tangibility. There was a reality of the relationship there, the dynamic of Jesus being real. So this was my introduction as a baby believer to following Jesus. There was a daily tangibility. He present in everything and in all the stuff. So going back to the kibbutz, the relationship was getting a little bit more romantic, say. We were starting to have plans that her parents in Germany, who were Catholic background, he had written them some letters about giving her life to Jesus and everything else. They were really afraid that she was involved in some cult. And they were asking sort of questions out of them being afraid or alarmed or whatever. And so she was feeling that she would go back to Germany, and then 3 weeks or so after that, I would follow. And then I'd meet her parents and, then live happily ever after, whatever. And the idea, the idea felt really good. You know, people had said to me, if you don't get a word from the Lord, you should leave Israel because Israel's too hard of a place to grow up as a baby believer. And so for me, this was like, okay. But the thing was always, if you don't get a word from the Lord, and that was a nice thing to say, but it was like I was very interested in going with the German girl, so I was really focused on, okay, let's go. And in a way, Israel would have become like an incredibly wonderful memory for me of giving my life to the Lord in the beginnings of everything. But all of a sudden, really a few days before she was about to take off and go back to Germany, I ended up, because I'm a believer now, I'm not going to sleep with her, right? And so, yeah, that was real evidence for me for sure. And it was like, so I had a family on the kibbutz that had adopted me as a part of this program for learning Hebrew. So it was a kibbutz family, both were Jewish. My kibbutz mother was Hungarian background. She was born in Israel, but her mother was a Holocaust survivor. And my kibbutz father was Polish background. And so I would always go there for coffee, and I got to know him, and it became a part of the family for sure. So when Ilona, the German girl, would be sleeping in my room, I would go over and sleep on their couch. And so I go over, yeah, my kibbutz father, and they said, yeah, it's like, I'm going to crash here tonight. And they said, you're welcome, whatever, and all this stuff. And so the night that I was staying there, getting ready to go to sleep, all these plans about Germany and this girl were like a major focus floating around in my head for sure. And it was like all of a sudden you go to sleep, and I got woke up in the middle of the night, and I start thinking about the girl and the plans, and it was like a circle of thoughts going around in my head, which were really, really pleasant. All of a sudden, in the middle of the thinking and the planning, something came from the side. It was like an inner voice, but it was something jarring. It was almost like it was breaking into my thought patterns with something else. And the something else was Isaiah 14.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
All of a sudden, it's like I hear or I feel or whatever. It's really hard to explain. But all of a sudden, Isaiah 14 is communicated in abruptly
Now
into these other thoughts.
is Isaiah 14, had you been reading Isaiah 14? Was this a meaningful part of Bible? Is this something you would learn, or is this something
No.
completely outside of what you were familiar with?
Well, I'm a baby believer. Like I had read some portions of the New Testament,
Okay.
and I'd been given a Bible with an Old Testament,
Okay.
New Testament together, right?
Yeah.
And I knew enough that I knew that Isaiah was a book in the Old Testament,
Okay.
but the Old Testament was like, that's the big part.
Right.
It's not about Jesus, it's the big part, and it's all heavy with a bunch of stuff that I don't really understand. But I knew it was in there somewhere.
Okay, so when you heard you in your head, you've got this Isaiah 14 running through your head, right?
Right. All of a sudden, out of the blue, Isaiah 14. So what do I do with that? I go back, I'm thinking, oh, it's just something weird. So I go back to thinking about her because that was an easier thing to do for sure, because it was really nice. And so I'm back thinking about her, and all of a sudden, again, Isaiah 14 comes again with a little bit, in a sense, a little bit more oomph to it.
Yeah.
And it's stirring up inside of me a curiosity. But is it worth the curiosity to actually get out of my bed and go across the room to my backpack and I get my Bible out and then start to search for somewhere. It could take me a long time, you know,
Yeah.
but there was enough there, sort of of this push that I thought, okay, I'm just going to get up. And there was, again, it's always a blend of fear and like a drawing. Like there's this sense of wanting it to be something, but there's the fear that it won't be anything.
Right.
Or and like I was thinking, oh, what if I read this and it's somebody begat somebody and somebody else begat somebody else and all this stuff and it just whatever. But I thought, okay, I'll just go take a look. I find it, I actually find Isaiah, I get to 14. And the first verse of Isaiah 14 says that the Lord would have mercy on Jacob and he will bring Israel back to the land. And that the strangers will be joined to Jacob and become a part of the land. And that they would be strangers that would be joined to the land. And you have to understand, it's like because I've been in this Ulpan class, this Hebrew class, and I never knew I was a Gentile. When you live in Canada, you don't think on those terms. But all of a
Right.
sudden in Israel, and the kibbutz, me and the Japanese were obviously Gentiles. And all the other 38 kids, roughly our age, they're Jews from, maybe 20 different countries, all within this group. Most of the countries, this was my first time out of Canada, so I'm hearing about people from all over the place. But all of a sudden you realize that within these verses, the idea that God would yet have mercy on Jacob and that he will bring Israel back to the land, all of a sudden in those words within the chapter, I'm thinking, I'm seeing it every day in my Hebrew class. I'm seeing all these personalities that represent a nation, and the common factor between each one of these students is that they're Jews. But they're all personality-wise, they're completely characteristic of the country that they came from, with the accents and with even personalities, sort of as a country personality say. All of a sudden, I'm looking at that, but the other denominator within this, and that the strangers would be joined to Jacob and they would live in the land of the Lord. And I knew, I knew without any doubt, I'm one of the strangers. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting now back on the edge of the couch, basically with my Bible, and I'm looking at these words and I'm going, I think God is saying to me now that I'm supposed to stay in Israel, that I'm supposed to become a part. And the first thing I thought of was, this is not going to fly with Ilona for sure. This is not going to go well somehow.
Ilona was the name of the German girl.
Yes, that
Okay.
was the name of the German girl.
Okay.
And so I thought to myself, when I had asked people, what's it like to hear from God? When they would tell these stories, because I was intrigued and I wanted to know, what does he sound like? What is this interaction sound like to you? Is it actually words? Is it a thought? Is it a group of circumstances that has happened that you're now evaluating, a communication somehow? And in a lot of ways, it was a lot of all of that together. But the one thing they had said to me was that if it's a word of the Lord, you'll have this peace. Somehow you'll have a very deep peace within you. And I thought to myself as I laid back down on the couch, I'm not going to have much peace about this. Because I wanted to go to Germany.
Yeah.
It's like, this is romance, hardly anything could touch that. And it's like, so, but I laid back down and it was like, I just felt a blanket of, total peace come over me. And I went sound asleep, slept till the next morning. Ilona comes over and we're having breakfast together. And I told her this story. And she's fascinated with the story. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, what does that mean? What do we do about this? One of the things that people had always said to us in the beginning, if you feel like the Lord is speaking to you, somehow you have to confirm it. It has to be somehow confirmed that you know that this is the will of the Lord, especially if it's demanding a decision in some kind of a major shift. And so the two of us, like two little babies, like we don't really know anything, right? But our experience in Israel at the time, we had heard a lot of stories about people trying to get visas renewed, people being stopped at the airport if the religious that controlled the visa department knew that they were believers, they'd be stopped at the airport, put back on planes, people would get nasty letters from the Ministry of the Interiors that they had to leave the country because they knew they were missionaries and all this stuff.
Yeah.
There was all this stuff going on. And so all of a sudden, the two of us sitting around discussing, how do you confirm this? We made the decision that if I went to the Ministry of Interiors and I was, say, my position in Israel at the time was a volunteer on the kibbutz, so I was a tourist. And the next phase or the next rung in the ladder as far as staying in Israel would be a position that's called temporary residency.
Hmm.
And then there's permanent residency. And then there's citizenship. And so we knew a little bit about it. So I thought, you know what, if God really is saying this and he wants me to stay here, then I'm going to go ask for residency. So this is what we both agreed, is that this would be the confirmation. This would be the thing that, and in a way, it would have to satisfy both of us in a sense that this is God, because if it's God, then all of a sudden our immediate plans are thrown to the wind because this demands something else. And so that was then the idea that we would then step into the next phase of this thing and make the journey, that I would go to the Ministry of Interiors and make a request for residency.